Hello everyone, hope you're all having a great day. Today we're going to explore a story where a simple haircut, an unexpected reunion, and a forgotten past collide, revealing how one man's lost memories may still put the people he cares about in danger. If you enjoy this kind of story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our upcoming videos. The barbershop was small but lively, filled with warm light and the familiar hum of electric clippers. The barber leaned down slightly and gently reminded Dewey to straighten his back, telling him that sitting properly would help him avoid feeling sore later. Dewey nodded obediently, trying his best to sit still. Nearby, Truong stood with his arms loosely crossed, watching closely, occasionally chiming in to encourage Dewey to behave. "Sit still for a bit longer," Truong said, his voice deep and calm. "You'll look really handsome when it's done." His words carried genuine hope, but beneath that hope lingered something heavier, a quiet regret. Even as he smiled at Dewey, the emptiness in his own memories remained unchanged. He could feel it, like a hollow space he didn't know how to fill. As instructed, Dewey lowered his head and sat patiently, while his hair soaked for nearly 20 minutes. He didn't complain once. When it was time to trim the bangs, he stayed perfectly still, eyes focused ahead, trusting the adults around him. The scissors moved carefully, gliding through strands of hair with soft rhythmic sounds. When the haircut was finally finished, the barber brushed away the loose hair and turned the chair slightly toward the mirror. The moment felt like a small climax. Truong leaned forward, eyes lighting up. "Wow," he said sincerely. "You look really beautiful." Dewey beamed at his reflection, then quickly turned to the barber and said thank you in a clear, polite voice. Truong reached into his pocket, paid 20,000 VND, and nodded in appreciation. After exchanging goodbyes, they prepared to leave. The barbershop remained warm behind them, filled with children's laughter and the fresh, clean scent of newly cut hair. As they stepped outside, Truong realized something had shifted inside him. The heavy pressure from his past, his missing memories, the unanswered questions felt lighter, at least for now. In its place was a simple, present joy. Being here with Dewey. Every small gesture from the child felt like medicine. A smile, a word, a laugh. It all soothed something deep inside him, even the lingering ache around the old head wound. And yet, regret still followed closely behind. Regret over the time he had vanished. Regret over the life he couldn't remember. The contrast was striking. Dewey's fresh haircut made him look bright and renewed, while Truong's inner world was still shadowed by uncertainty. That contrast became a turning point. Watching the child, Truong silently made a decision. No matter what dangers might exist out there, no matter what his past held, he would protect Dewey. As they walked away, Dewey turned back cheerfully and waved goodbye to the barber, calling out loudly. Truong smiled without realizing it. Around them, other adults glanced over, some with casual interest, others with subtle concern. Truong felt it, a quiet envy, a sense that not everyone's worries were so easily set aside. The entire haircut scene replayed in his mind like slow, cinematic footage. He remembered the scissors moving through Dewey's hair, the careful focus, the quiet trust. He remembered standing there, watching, feeling more emotion than he had in a long time. The pressure to protect this small, fragile sense of family intertwined with the hope sparked by Dewey's new look. Stepping into the sunlight, they both squinted slightly. The warmth felt good. From there, they began the journey back. Each step was slow, thoughtful, filled with introspection. It felt symbolic, like old hair falling away to make room for something new, while old scars still remained beneath the surface. That moment deepened everything. It emphasized Truong's inner conflict, caught between renewal and shadows that refused to disappear. Even in simple scenes like this, vulnerability and resilience quietly coexisted, especially within bonds that felt almost like family. On the way back, Truong noticed Dewey fidgeting slightly from the heat. He picked up a small fan and gently fanned him, asking if he still felt hot. Tieu shook his head, smiling, clearly comfortable. They stopped for a short rest before continuing home. That was when a familiar voice cut through the air. "Truong, is that you?" He turned, surprised. A woman stood a few steps away, her expression a mix of shock and disbelief. For a brief second, Truong couldn't place her. He searched his memory, but nothing came. Seeing his confusion, she stepped closer. "It's me." "How? I was your assistant, your colleague." Her words stirred something. Not a clear memory, but a faint recognition. Slowly connections formed, fragments triggered by things Tieu had once mentioned. Truong nodded, his expression steady but heavy with regret. "I'm sorry," he said honestly. "I didn't recognize you at first." Tieu looked up at her and greeted her politely, calling her auntie. Hao immediately smiled, bending slightly to respond warmly. The emotional tension rose as Hao asked what had happened. Truong didn't avoid the question. He explained simply that he had lost his memory, that he had been found by his foster mother and later by Tieu. His voice remained calm, but the weight behind each word was undeniable. They stood there, the open road stretching around them. A light wind carried dust and the scent of asphalt through the air. The space felt open, yet the atmosphere was tense. Inside, Truong felt a shift, from peaceful hope back to the pressure of secrets tied to his past. He felt the bond with Tieu more strongly than ever. The child stood close, unaware of the complexity unfolding. The unexpected meeting with Hao stirred regret over everything Truong couldn't remember, standing in sharp contrast to Hao's visible excitement at seeing him alive. After a moment, Truong gestured for them to sit nearby. He asked Hao about her work now, easing the conversation into safer territory. That simple act marked another turning point, opening the door to deeper revelations. Tieu stayed close, and Truong found himself constantly glancing down, instinctively worried about the child's safety. A quiet thought repeated in his mind. Some things were better kept secret, at least for now. This scene played out like a slow film. The camera in his mind moved from Hao's stunned expression to his own thoughtful silence. Beneath the surface, his emotions were layered and tangled. Relief, fear, curiosity, caution. Mentions of the bullet wound flickered briefly in his thoughts, raising pressure in his chest. But alongside that fear, a small glimmer of hope appeared. Hao was here. She knew the past. Maybe she could help. Every greeting, every exchanged glance felt like a thread connecting who he was to who he might become again. Past and present quietly intertwined. That moment added new depth to everything, highlighting Truong's emotional swings between rediscovery and restraint. The open road around them contrasted sharply with the confinement he felt inside. It underscored a central theme. Reconnection is possible, but it comes with lingering shadows, especially when memory, danger, and responsibility all collide. They talked for a while longer, the afternoon light slowly shifting as the sun dipped lower in the sky. Hao took a breath, then began explaining more about Truong's past, choosing her words carefully. She told him that he had once been the captain of an investigation police team. Not just any position. He had led many subordinates, handled major cases, and carried significant responsibility. Then, during an assignment, he disappeared without a trace. No body, no clear answers, just silence. Truong listened quietly. He admitted without hesitation that he remembered nothing. No cases, no colleagues, no sense of authority or rank. The man Hao described felt like a stranger to him. He said he knew he couldn't return to work in his current condition, but he asked her for one thing, that the unit be informed he was alive, yet his whereabouts kept confidential. His voice was low and steady, but beneath it was pressure. Real fear. He wasn't worried about himself as much as he was worried about Tieu and Tieu. The thought that his past could bring danger to their present life unsettled him deeply. Hao nodded, understanding more than she let on. She explained that after his disappearance, the unit had searched for a long time. Every lead ended in nothing. Eventually, with no progress, people were reassigned, cases closed, and life moved on, at least officially. The emotional peak of the conversation came when Truong asked a difficult question. Back then, were there people who envied me, hated me? Hao hesitated before answering. Then she admitted the truth. Yes, there were people who resented him. People who felt threatened by his position or success. But there had never been solid proof. Nothing concrete enough to act on. The air felt heavier after that. Late afternoon sunlight stretched long shadows across the ground, painting the scene in gold and amber. That visual contrast mirrored Truong's inner state. Regret over the past blended with a cautious spark of hope. For the first time, he wasn't just reacting, he was starting to investigate his own life. He felt the attachment to his current family more intensely than ever. Every detail Hao mentioned felt like a blade cutting into the blank space where his memories should be. The gap between who he once was, an important figure, and who he was now, a man with no identity, felt vast. That realization became another turning point. As dusk approached, Truong glanced at Dewey, who had been standing quietly nearby the entire time. The child's patience and silence only made Truong more protective. He stood up, signaling that it was time to go. "We should head home," he said calmly. The conversation scene replayed in his mind like a slow cinematic sequence. If there were a camera, it would linger on his clenched hands, revealing how torn he felt inside. The pressure from potential enemies, from unknown dangers, began to rise again. Yet alongside that pressure was a faint but steady hope. New information meant new direction. Every question he had asked Hao felt like a step deeper into his own history. Not all answers were comforting, but they were necessary. As they parted, they agreed to meet again another time, somewhere safer. Before leaving, Truong made a clear request. He asked Hao to keep his return a secret for now. He wanted time to investigate quietly, to identify who might still hold resentment against him. Most importantly, he wanted to protect Tieu and Dewey from any possible harm. Hao looked at him seriously, then nodded. She agreed. She could see the resolve in his eyes, different from the man she once knew, yet grounded in the same sense of responsibility. Truong thanked her sincerely. They decided the next meeting would take place at Tieu's home, where things felt more controlled and secure. His voice carried both regret for the past and hope for what lay ahead. They said their goodbyes. Dewey waved cheerfully at Hao, his happiness completely genuine. He said he was excited to go home. That simple statement eased something tight in Truong's chest. As they walked away, twilight wrapped around them. The sky burned with crimson and orange hues, casting everything in soft, fading light. Truong held Dewey's hand firmly as they headed back toward his foster mother's place. That walk marked a significant psychological shift. The pressure of danger was still there. If anything, it felt closer now. But it was no longer paralyzing. Instead, it fueled something else, a determination to protect. A sense of purpose rooted not in rank or authority, but in human connection. Each step forward felt like a quiet opposition between past darkness and present light. Behind him were unanswered questions and hidden threats. Ahead of him was a small hand in his, and the image of Tieu waiting at home. The final turning point came in the smallest moment. Dewey laughed suddenly, pointing at something along the road, his joy simple and unguarded. Truong looked down at him and smiled inwardly. Not a forced smile. A real one. The scene felt like a slow cinematic closing shot. If someone were watching, the camera would track their figures from behind as they moved farther down the road, growing smaller against the glowing horizon. Inside Truong, emotions remained complex. Fear, uncertainty, responsibility. But hope glimmered steadily beneath it all. This ending carried weight. Truong was no longer just a man haunted by shadows. He was someone making conscious choices, choosing caution, choosing patience, choosing to prioritize the people who mattered most now. The sunset became a quiet metaphor, the end of a long, difficult day, the acknowledgement that darkness would come, but also the promise that morning would follow. Life ahead was uncertain. The past was still fragmented. Threats might still linger in unseen corners. But within that uncertainty, Truong felt something solid for the first time in a long while. A reason to stay alert, a reason to move forward, and a reason to protect the fragile, meaningful bonds that had given his life new direction. The story follows Truong, a man living with lost memories, as he shares quiet, meaningful moments with Tieu, the child of his girlfriend Tieu. A simple trip to the barbershop becomes a turning point, revealing Truong's growing emotional attachment and his resolve to protect the small family he has come to care for. On the way home, an unexpected encounter with Hao, a former colleague, pulls Truong back toward his forgotten past. He learns that he was once a high-ranking investigation police captain who disappeared after a dangerous mission. Though fragments of his past resurface, Truong chooses caution, asking Hao to keep his return a secret. Torn between buried threats and present bonds, he decides to investigate quietly while prioritizing the safety of Tieu and Tieu, finding new purpose in protecting the life he is rebuilding.